All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. And so I promise no more math from me. I tortured y'all enough yesterday with the math exercise, so we're going to talk a little bit more conceptual now, and really try to give you some things to think about as you start laying out thinking about laying out a grazing system. And I think a common theme that you'll probably hear out of me is that we don't want to go out there and just throw some waters over here and put some fence up over there and say we've got a grazing system, right? Because we're going to spend a lot of money to make those improvements, and we want to make sure that we do them right. They're not easy. Those aren't necessarily easy things to change once we put them in. So one of the first things we've got to think about is, what is the goal? What is the goal of your particular operation, of your particular grazing system? I think this is a really good opportunity to start thinking about where you're at and where you want to go, and knowing that most of us are probably not where we ultimately want to be. We're somewhere in that middle ground, right? So what are your goals? Is it getting more even grazing distribution, right? Improving grass utilization. We talked a lot about that yesterday. Enhancing manure distribution, right? We can see the importance of things like that, especially when we start getting into really high input costs. If we've got the ability to spread that manure around on the operation, we're gonna be better off in that situation. Increase carrying capacity, right? We've talked a lot about carrying capacity and the potential benefits when we think about these enhanced grazing systems to potentially be able to carry more livestock on our operation. Improving profit margins, right? Improving the forage persistency of the forages that we have on our operation. Allowing forages to rest. That's one of the best, biggest benefits we get out of a rotational grazing system, is that rest period, so that our plants can replenish their root reserves. We saw the examples of different root systems, right, yesterday when Dr. Smith was talking about those. Better animal performance, right, and especially when we think about the ability to have a better forage product there. And allows us to keep that forage in a vegetative state, right? So these are you'd probably look at this and say, yeah, all of those are my goals, right? In an ideal system. But it's important to manage our expectations, right? So I can sometimes be a perfectionist, at least in my own mind, right? So it's really easy for me to get caught up in the details. I'm sure nobody else is like that in the room. It's really easy to get caught up in the details and want things to be perfect, right? If we're going to go out and do this, we want to do it right. But we have to be realistic, right? So we've talked about this idea of once-a-day moves or even twice-a-day moves. But we all have lives, right? Folks in the room have kids. We're busy. We're on boards. We're involved in our communities and things like that. And so realistically, we may not be able to do that once a day or twice a day moves, right? So something like twice a day is a really, or sorry, not twice a day, twice a week is a really happy medium, right? That can kind of be our target of where we want to get to. And maybe it's baby steps to get there. If we're going from a continuous graze system, it might, we might start at once a week, right? That's an improvement over where we were. And then we can get to that twice a week move. It's important to recognize that when we start to implement these processes on our farms, we're not going to see an immediate change, right? This is a slow system. And I like the word system, right? Because it all works together, and so every little piece of this that we're improving works together, but that's going to take time. And so managing that expectation that it might be 3 to 5 years before you really get that improvement in forage that you were after. So I think that's really important when we think about managing those expectations, that we don't just try it for a year and say, oh man, my forages still aren't where I want them to be. I wasn't able to increase my carrying capacity. I'm done with this. pull out the temporary fences, pull out the waters, let's go back to continuous grazing. Let's give it some time to work. And then the best, I think one of the best pieces of advice we have on here is don't get set into a mindset, right? So I said twice a week moves is ideal, but when we're in that spring period where we've got rapid forage growth of our cool season grasses, or if we get into a drought like many of us experienced this year, we're going to have to adjust that mindset and work with what's actually in front of us. And so I think Dr. Hallich was the one that gave the example of throwing out the book yesterday. And I personally like books and data a lot, but I got to agree with Dr. Hallich, right? We got to be flexible and understand that we're working in an agricultural system, and not everything's going to always be by the book. So when we start thinking about some of these, about our grazing system, we've got to start to evaluate our operation, or the operation that we're working on, right? So what are the land resources? What soil types are there? What slopes are we looking at? How are we going to work around those things, because we can't change those things? Livestock groups, right? When we come on a farm, are we on an operation that's got both fall and spring calving cow groups? So maybe we've got a couple different groups of cows. That's something to consider. Are we on an operation that manages younger growing cattle, right? Either developing heifers or stocker calves. That's going to be something we think about and consider. How easy are those cattle to move, right? If we start with a group of cattle that have always been continuously grazed, and we start moving them, it's going to take a little bit of time to train them to that system. Shade and water availability. This is right there. It's probably one of the biggest obstacles we're going to deal with. And we've already shown some examples of that, and you'll see some more in this presentation of how we can try to add to or better utilize some of our shade and water resources. And then, of course, thinking about our ability to allow forages on operation to rest. So forage rest is really the key to making this whole thing work. That's the whole reason we're doing this, is to allow forages to rest. Obviously, like I talked about with the differences in environmental conditions and seasonality, that rest period is going to change, right? So fast growth in the spring and fall, we're going to have fewer rest days, right? Maybe 14, 21 days. In the summer, when we get those hot, dry conditions, we've got to allow for longer rest. So again, how we manage that system throughout the year is going to change. And it's all about that flexibility. And quite frankly, it's all about trial and error, right? As you get started, the most important thing is to get started, right? And then we're going to figure it out as we go a little bit. Rest period is what we really need to be thinking about when we think about paddock numbers, right? So we talked about that rest period length over the number of days we're going to be in that particular paddock and adding one to it. So the example there of about 30 days of rest, 4 days in the rotation, so maybe on that 2 week, twice a week kind of move, you're going to be about 4 days, 4 to 3 days. 8 paddocks is what we're looking at, right? And so thinking about what is ideal helps us understand what we need to try to get to in these systems. Water. Water is probably the biggest challenge that we've got when we think about setting up these rotational grazing systems, right? Where is the water? Because they've got to have water. We know that's the most important nutrient out there. We've got to provide water. And so when we start thinking about especially going from a continuous system to a rotational system, now all of a sudden, we're trying to move cattle to areas where we don't necessarily have water. And that's a challenge that we've got to overcome. I oversee the management of our cow herd at the research center. One of the things you'll see if you drive through our farm right now is that all of our waters are right along the road, right at the fence in the corner of a field. Now, that's not necessarily ideal for a rotational grazing system, right? It's ideal if we're just wanting to drive through and make sure the waters are on, but it's not ideal for a rotational grazing system. And we're not the only people in the world that have that challenge or have that problem, right? So when we think about waters, we got to think about the distance to the water, right? Because cattle are going to have to travel to that water back and forth. They're not going to necessarily hang out at the water all day long. And so when we keep water within an 800-foot radius of where the cattle are, we can get them to go to the water by themselves or maybe in a small group versus maybe a herd of 50 all coming up at the same time. The other thing that can happen when you get the whole herd coming up to the water, especially if you've got some of those ball-type waters, is obviously boss cow gets up there first. She's going to get whatever water she wants. And she's the same cow that's going to lead the herd back away from the water. And so you've got some of those animals that are a little lower in the herd that don't necessarily get the same amount of time to access that water. Now, 800 feet, that's just the kind of the goal, right? That's the ideal. But this is the real world, and we'll recognize that that's just not always possible. So recognize that cattle in range conditions out west travel up to a mile to get to water. So yeah, we want to keep that 800 figure in mind, but don't think that, oh gosh, the closest I can get it is 900 feet. You're still going to be okay in that situation. Just we try to keep it to that 800 if at all possible. Temporary systems, right? We looked at those yesterday. You set them up yesterday. That's a great tool to use to figure out where the permanent waters need to go, right? Because there's nothing worse than spending a bunch of money, running a water line, putting a new waterer out there, and then a year or two later you're like, man, I really wish I'd put it over there. With a temporary system, we can try things out and kind of narrow down where we want that to go. So when we think about watering systems, we want things to start looking like this, right? We want them in the middle of the field, right? Because what happens when it's in the middle of the field? We get more uniform distribution around that water. We get more uniform grazing in those paddocks. What happens when we put it up here in the corner and we try to break out into paddocks and we start getting these kind of pie-shaped wedges, we get a concentration of nutrients up here by the water, and it doesn't necessarily evenly distribute across that field. And so these are things that we need to think about when we look at our map and we start trying to lay this out. How can we get it to the center, right? How can we get it as close to the center as possible? Other things to think about, right? We talked a lot about utilizing, fencing cattle out of ponds, and we can still utilize ponds and springs as our water source. If you're running on municipal water, recognize that that's coming at a cost. And so these are some rates from here in Woodford County. And so just looking at the cost of a 50 cow herd with calves and their bulls, that's real money, right? That's real money that we're spending to provide water from a municipal water source. That's in addition to the cost of water lines and drinkers and things like that. So recognize that of course, water is not necessarily free, and so those things come at a cost. So I love this map because I think it's a little more real world, right? We talk a lot about squares and getting these perfect little squares, right? You all did a really nice job yesterday measuring off your 35 feet and getting your perfect little square or rectangle in most cases. But this is an example of a farm that was leased ground. So they had to be careful about what kind of inputs they put into this property. And so if you look at it, the blue circles here, those are permanent waters. The orange squares are temporary tanks. And then they had a spring-fed tank over here. And then, of course, you can see their different fence lines that they developed. And so one of the things, if you'll look around here, they've got 13 paddocks, right? They've got 13 different places that they could move these cattle. They're not all perfectly square, but I think you can agree that they attempted to get there, right? And so recognize that it's really easy for us to draw a square and print it in your book. It's a little bit more difficult necessarily to get that perfect in real life, depending on the land that you're on. And so other things to kind of think about here, right? So we have on here that this permanent water up here was a mistake. Can anybody tell me maybe why that might be? Not servicing multiple fields, right? If you look at it, it's sitting right here. And it could be, you've got another one right here. And so you could have moved it down and had it service both 1 and 2. The other thing that I didn't tell you about this field that kind of adds to the reason why that would be a mistake is that this up here is actually their receiving lot, right? So that's where the calves came in. It's where they kind of got them settled in and got them ready to turn out on pasture. So calves were only in here for a short period of time. So this is a perfect example where something temporary could have served that purpose within this lot, and then you move that permanent water somewhere else on the farm where it could potentially serve multiple pastures as needed and be more centrally located, because you see, even though it's serving that lot and serving 2, it's up here in the corner of 2. So again, start temporary, right? It's relative compared to putting in permanent fences and permanent water systems. It's pretty affordable. It's pretty cost effective. And so it's going to allow you the opportunity to figure out what works. And then you can determine if it's ground that you own. You can determine if it's worth, the inputs to make some of those things permanent. Some of these things may stay temporary the whole time, right? And especially if we're dealing with any kind of leased ground, having temporary systems that you can put into place and take with you when you go is certainly ideal. So allows you to figure out where these best spots are and make changes as you go. Take good advantage of your cost share funds, right? So Adam's been talking about opportunities for cost share funds. We can make better use of those funds if we know exactly where we want these things to go, or if we can use them to get the temporary supplies as well. So think about those things. Think about, our interior fences being single-strand electric fences that can be moved, right? If we've got the perimeter there, well then we can easily move those interior systems and make it flexible for us. Yes, we've already talked about electric fencing, but let's hit on that again. Jeremy McGill yesterday gave y'all a great presentation on electric fencing, and he could have probably taught you for several more hours about it. Thinking about using that hot wire as your extension cord, right? So we can again go wherever we need to go on that operation. We're not necessarily limited. Allowing us to hook up temporary fences, but of course, if we want that whole idea and that whole system to work, we've got to do it right. So what's going on in that picture? What's wrong here? That's it, right? So it is. If you look here, this temporary wire here, this temporary fence here, is hooked onto a wire that's not hot. And I do not claim to be an expert in electricity, but I know that is not going to work out well, right? So I know I really wish Jeremy was here. It's Jeremy McGill. Well, if you really want to make his skin crawl, show him a picture like that. So yes, and then of course the metal T-posts as well in a hot wired system like that. All right, heat stress. This is one of my personal favorite topics to talk about. This is another challenge. It's right up there with getting the water in these systems. It's providing shade. Okay, so the other problem we have in this region, we've talked a lot about endophyte infected fescue toxicosis. It causes those blood vessels to constrict. They can't move the blood around as well, and that does not allow them to dissipate heat. So you take fescue toxicosis plus high temperatures, and now we've just made both of those things worse. So when we think about shade, if the shade is really there to help eliminate some heat stress, we don't necessarily require shade annually, right? We have times of the year where shade's not going to be as important as others. So we need to think about that when we're laying out these systems. Where are these cattle going to go on a hot day? Which paddocks are best set up for that? And are we going to have the forage available in those fields at the time of year that we need them to be in those fields versus saving areas that maybe don't have shade resources for times of the year when shade's not going to be as important to our cattle. So, a lot of questions about shade type, right? We've got all these portable shade structures. You saw them out there at our farm yesterday. You may have noticed a couple different kinds that they have out there. But then the whole idea of natural shade versus artificial shade. Natural is more ideal, but we've probably all seen it, right? A bunch of cows up under a single tree in a field. They're there all summer long because we're not rotationally grazing, and so they spend a good majority of that summer up under that tree. And then all of a sudden we see erosion around that tree, we see all the tree roots, and if we look up, there's a bunch of dead branches there. And if we come back 5 years later, the tree's probably dead. It may have blown over in a storm. We see it, right? We see that exact situation. And so the damage that our cattle can cause to trees and to our shade resources is real. And so making sure that we've got enough trees for the number of animals. So that prime example of one tree for 20 cows, that's a dead tree. It's not gonna make it. It doesn't stand a chance. Avoid things like pines or wild cherries that obviously can cause problems for livestock. The other thing we can do to help the trees is rotate to new paddocks often. The trees are getting a rest, right? And so we can move them around so that they're not spending the entire summer under that one single tree that we have in the field. Right, so here's some examples of cattle up under these trees. You can see clearly they have spent quite a bit of time under those couple trees. Here's an up-close picture of what's under there, and certainly that's not what we're going for. This might look familiar too, right? In those situations, we get a lot of mud. When we're in the middle of a drought and you can go up under a tree and there's a mud hole because the cattle have been standing under there the entire summer, that's probably not ideal. Other thing that's going on in this situation, right? They've been up under here. We've got their water under there, so they have no reason to leave this place. But they can also get bored and play with the float and overfill their trough, which is probably what they did to help with that in that particular situation. Again, recognize that cattle, they're prey animals, right? They are prey animals, and so even though we have a lot of trees here, recognize that they will typically stay on the edges of the tree line and come together. So they stay right along that tree line edge. So again, in addition to the forage pressure, allowing our cattle to move from paddock to paddock so that we're not just standing under the same trees over and over again can also be helpful. Here's some just simple designs for artificial shade, because in a real world, we may not have the shade resources on day one that we need, right? It's going to take time, even if we go in and do some plantings, it's going to take time for those to become shade trees that our cattle can utilize. So thinking of some simple structures that can provide shade obviously thinking of the pitch of the roof and how that shadow is going to throw, because we certainly want to be able to take advantage of that shadow in the hottest parts of the day. So how much shade do they need? So if we think about a typical cow's maybe 7 to 8 feet long, about 3 to 4 feet wide. She's 20 to 30 square feet. So if we have I told y'all there was no math here, but I lied. But 40 square feet per cow, maybe about 20 square foot for the calf. And so you can start to see here how our shade structures would need to be quite large, right? So consider the ground below. And if you're going to go into an area that's going to have heavy use, think about developing that area for that heavy use with some geotextile fabric and gravel to help that area under the shade structure. Lanes from a cattle handling standpoint and cattle moving standpoint on an operation are fantastic. They can be permanent or temporary, but man, they make moving and sorting cattle a breeze. I think if you noticed around the farm that you were on yesterday, they have a pretty good lane system out there to get cattle to and from the different working facilities that they have there. And I've got another example of one that has that as well. And that makes things so much more efficient and easy when we're trying to get cattle up. Recognizing that we're going to lose some manure nutrients on the lane and erosion if we don't do it correctly. So think about where we put those. This is an example, and I think it's a farm in western Kentucky, but I don't remember exactly where it was. But here's an example of a lane. You'll notice that they've got temporary gates here, so they can move this around and open this area up for cattle in either one of these pastures and actually have their water in that lane. And so they can actually utilize this high traffic area of this lane because they put gravel down here as part of their pasture rotation system. So kind of a neat idea there of putting the water actually in the lane. And then it's still convenient to drive the truck by and make sure that the water is working. Mm-hmm. Yep. I think I understand your question, and so I think it just depends on how you're setting that system up and how they're moving through. Like if you're just like this one here, it's allowing you to go through basically 2 paddocks, but if you had it in the center, that particular system, you could potentially run through 4. And so you.
So I mean that's a great question. And there's just so much diversity in layout. The ideal situation would be you would center the water in the paddock, and then you can subdivide that paddock into 4 pieces, right? Without back grazing. But we don't live in an ideal world, right? In some back grazing is not going to be the end of the world, like Greg said yesterday. I mean that's just the reality of a grazing system. But ideally,
yeah.
Not having him travel in the lane and not having him back graze would be the ideal situation.
Okay, we talked about shape and being as square as possible, and that really comes, that can come from the cost of fencing and water materials are minimized, and I'll show you a picture that illustrates that pretty well. We can share water points between paddocks as much as possible, so whether that's the 2 that we see here or 4 like we talked about when we can get it in the center of that larger field. But it allows us to use the least amount of fence that's needed to get the job done. And so if we look at these, we've got this is 1,600 feet long here. And so if we look at squares versus rectangles, if each of those long lines is 1,600 feet, we can start to see that obviously there's a difference in terms of the amount of fencing that we're going to use in those systems, with less being in the more square shaped field. Yep. Yep. Mm-hmm. Right, and that's what we do when we think about strip grazing. When we think about utilizing stockpiled tall fescue, that's the whole idea there, because we don't have to worry about the regrowth in the stockpiled system. So that's the time where starting at the water and moving the fence out would be the way to do it, which is growth.
I mean, if it's good conditions, I mean, you'll start to get graceful regrowth in 3 to 5 days probably. After grazing that regrowth off is not ideal. Within the season. It's detrimental to the plants. Right. Right. Yeah, they're just, like we talked about yesterday, you keep depleting the carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm. They don't get the rest period. Right. Yep. So again, math to start, we did that yesterday, and then it's really an art from there, and you've heard that concept repeated throughout all of this. So really just understanding the concepts and the math that's behind those concepts, but then putting it into practice will take art and flexibility and tweaking. So.